So we're going to start with some words of welcome with two special people from the City Council. They work together, but in different sectors. So Vera, why is this subject so important for you? So hello to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with Paul and Laura and this project. I'd like to thank People's Palace Projects and their whole team for their dedication to this type of investigation and reflection and thinking about these consequences, which are often invisible for those people looking after a disaster, because the disaster is so much bigger than us that we lose ourselves in it. We can't even see it. Laura and myself are from different departments. Laura is president of RTH, and I am the coordinator of the council's different facilities, but we work together. So after these words of welcome, I'm going to quote for you something talking about heritage and culture and poetry. We have two examples in literature which are really important for us to understand these ties that exist between these things. The first poem is Confidência da Tabiranha by Carlos Drummond de Andrade, because it's a very rich but difficult poem, because Drummond has easier poems, but there are lessons on the internet about this specific poem. They are, for me, mandatory lessons, life lessons for any human being, whether they speak Portuguese or not. So I'd like to offer you that tip, seeing that we're talking about culture here. And the second literary work, which I'd like to mention, it's an international work. It's Victor Hugo, Notre Dame de Paris. I don't know if you know, but the first fire at Notre Dame was totally destructive, perhaps even more than the most recent one. And the whole heritage team in France was involved in reconstructing those details in the architecture that you see in Notre Dame. And they based it on Victor Hugo's literary works, because he didn't just describe absolutely everything about that particular cathedral, but he also drew the frescoes as well. So you can understand from that the importance of culture and literature for our existence and for maintaining this cultural heritage. Talk about natural heritage and architectural heritage. So I just wanted to also give you that little tip, and once again welcome you all here today. And now over to Laura. I'd also like to say rather that we have a poet rather, Tiago from Itabira, and he will give us a performance at the end. So hello to everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. On behalf of the Municipal Secretariat of Culture. So our institute, which is called the Patrimônio de Humanidade Instituto, World Heritage Institute, is always involved in these issues, because we're here to protect heritage, because culture and heritage, as Vera said, they're all the same thing, because in a film, in a play, in an event, in a show, you're there effectively safeguarding traditions and beliefs and everything that is involved in a society's culture. And heritage also involves the material elements, where culture happens, and also the intangible culture, which are those beliefs and traditions. And what happens is that this goes way beyond um, a physical structure of architecture or an intervention. It's all to do with strengthening the identity of a society. Um, Talking about whether that's tangible, intangible heritage, because they map our identity. So these research projects are incredibly important to make people aware of this, because if we're not aware of this, if we're not aware that that's important for us, then, what's the point of us doing our work, my work and Vera's work, because it won't happen. So as Paul said, it's very important to see young people here present, because also in our institute there are younger people too. Myself and Christina are the more experienced warriors in this story, but for you young people, you're the people who are responsible for bringing this, taking this forward. I think awareness is so important, and the awareness that this creates our identity is very important. And as for the rest, we'll try and sort of mitigate um, any problems or damage, but we need to understand that culture and heritage are the basis of a society, a community. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to recognize Christina Lodge here, who has been working in this area of cultural heritage for a long time. Um, there are also other colleagues of mine who are giving me institutional support here, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation, Paul, and I really hope that we do other projects together to help benefit our cultural heritage. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Laura and Vera. So just to let you know, we're using microphones because we are recording all of this, and these resources will be made available to you. And we're also going to take this conversation to the school Spectacle, which is based in the port area of the city. It's an institution which every year trains new artists from the whole of Rio. It's an incredibly important school. And Carla, I'm very grateful for you being here. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of our two incredible Libras interpreters, um, Camila and her colleague, because we're recording this in Libras and also in English, so that all these resources are available later. Fabi, could you explain us a little bit about this video and the other webinars that you can also access? So, good morning. I've got some notes here so that I don't forget anything, but this seminar is a combination of 4 webinars that we did online with researchers from other countries which also work in this field of in the environment of disasters, crimes, and climate crises, and their effect and impact on cultural heritage, whether that's tangible or intangible. And the idea is to be able to share these methodologies that have already been used in other places, not just to share them with you in Brazil, but for Brazil to also share its methodologies with the rest of the world. So we had 4 different meetings, which were incredibly interesting. We had researchers from the University of Edinburgh talking about ways of combating the climate crisis. Um, We also had a speaker from an island which is based off the coast of Yemen, um, where there is a lot of cultural heritage, but that archaeological heritage wasn't just vandalized, but the presence of traditional cultures is under threat there. So we talked a lot about heritage as identity and tradition, history, and memory. We also had researchers from the University of Durham, Dr. Ashraf, talking about the risks to the cultural heritage of Istanbul, which has a huge wealth of heritage and has been very badly affected by flooding and landslides, just like Brazil. So he spoke to us. It was really interesting, wasn't it, Paul? Because he said you have to accept a level of risk and work out how heritage can reconstruct its history, also telling the story of these climate crises and disasters. Um, so you don't end up erasing what happened, but you recognize it and you incorporate it into its identity. And he's an engineer, so he was working more with tangible heritage, but he also talked to us about how we can tell this story, the story of these disasters, of the crimes, these environmental crimes, so that they're not erased. So in the reconstruction, this is told and is added to the local culture. William McGarry from the University of Belfast talked about the index of vulnerability to the climate crises for different cultural heritage in countries in Africa. And we had another interesting project called Risks to Cultural Heritage and the Instruments of Impact um, to create improvements in Malaysia. So how to create tools within traditional communities and how this can generate learning tools that are integrated and collaborative tools. It's never brought from outside to inside. And each time we talked about traditional communities, which are very specific, we obviously have a number of traditional and cultures uh, which are very traditional and very specific to certain places. But we also had Brazilians taking part. So Luana Campos from the Mato Grosso do Sul Federal University did a great talk about the indices and landmarks within Brazilian politics, which highlight the lack of legislation to protect cultural heritage. Because we talk a lot about the risk because of environmental problems. We also talk a lot about, sorry, danger to habitation and health and so on because of the climate crisis. But very rarely we talk about the cultural risks, which also affect our identity and our memory. And the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, like Natalia and Mariana, um, who are researchers from this foundation, they have been helping us, and they're going to be speaking later on a project on the river Rio Doce, and they're also going to be talking about the dam burst at Mariana and how that affected many traditional communities. And it's not possible to hear what Paul's saying because he's off mic, but just to remind you that all of these are recorded online in Portuguese and English. They've all shared their methodologies, all our speakers. So it was a very open set of webinars about how they did it. Um, and the idea is that people can also adopt these same tools. And if anybody is interested, um, you can get in touch with People's Palace Project. We can put you in touch with those researchers or present more findings from their projects. So all of that is on our YouTube channel, People's Palace Project's YouTube channel. You can get in touch with us, and you should have all our contacts for social media and for getting in touch by email. Thank you. Let's move on to the methodologies now. But I promise you it's going to be fascinating. We've got three methodologies. First of all, PPP will present what we did with the groups in Minas Gerais state. Then Natalia and Mariana will present a project in Mariana in Minas. And then the last methodology is an experiment. We're going to bring together the band, São Sebastião band from Brumadinho, with a rapper from Itabira and a percussionist from a quilombo from Marinhos, near Mariana. And we're here to be able to create new networks between engineers and artists and so on. So, Natalia and Vittoria, let's present our methodology. Are you going to sit on the stage? So I've already explained a bit of the basis of this methodology. What is important about all these projects, which are on the internet, there are four, five, six projects. They're all about the participation of civil society. We can't think about these threats without involving people. So we've got this project, which we carried out in Itabira, Mariana, Nova Lima, Brumadinho, and the Marinhos Quilombo. But in all of them was to create a participative process. And and as the city council said, you have to start mapping things because if you don't know what you're going to say, you need to map first. So we did that with the communities because they know what they want to look at. They know what local culture is. So Roots of Resilience, which took place in the Iron Quadrangle in Minas Gerais, which is also a very important water source or region of water. And we feel that it should be defined because of these water features. And on our site, you'll find the methodologies that we use, which are based on other methodologies that we've used in various projects, always thinking about what the value of culture is. And as I said before, it's important to do this with young people because cultural value is not just the price you can get from it, but when you think about how we can measure its value, you can even ask, say, for example, your grandparents or your neighbors what the value of culture is. So we work with these artists to think about what the value is of this culture that they are creating. So we created instruments for them to be able to define this value. Here are the names of the different organizations in Minas we worked with. So this methodology, this research methodology, talks about the socio-economic values and relations, but I'm now going to ask Natalia and Vittoria. Oh, it's just going to be Natalia who's going to talk a little bit more about the methodology. So good morning to you. It's an honor to be here, concluding this sequence of presentations about methodologies. As Fabiana explained, we had the opportunity to get to know other methodologies done by researchers who were financed by the same foundation, all with the same concern, how to integrate research about cultural heritage and the climate and other environmental issues. So this project, Roots of Resilience, it it brought a whole wealth of experience from a methodology which is in constant construction for this new type of work with cultural heritage and environmental issues. So this methodology, which is called relative values, is what Paul was explaining. It understands culture beyond monetary parameters or economic ones. So it works with a concept that is also non-monetary. And we applied this methodology in all other contexts, and we decided to apply it here in this region in Minas Gerais to be able to bring together these approaches, the approach looking at cultural values, proposing new ways of measuring the value of culture, and a process of mapping what has been done and the risks to this cultural heritage, especially in this context of the state of Minas Gerais and this quadrangle. So Roots of Resilience has this background. We um, worked with these 6 partner organizations that we've already mentioned, and the methodology was constructed it, on the basis of co-creation. We brought these organizations and the people to construct research instruments that could define the value of culture and what is being done and what is being produced in terms of culture in that region. And we also looked at this, the perceived risks, environmental risks, that is, also was part of this project. And when we talk about the pandemic, the idea of environmental risks also had to include this kind of risk. So we worked with the perceived risks from dam bursts, from the risks, perceived risks that generally mining provokes, because beyond the dam bursts, it also causes harm and also some environmental risks such as deforestation and exploration, predatory exploration. And that's very strong in Minas Gerais. So we use qualitative and quantitative methodologies to this end. What does this mean? So quantitative methodologies give you an overview, but it's more of a superficial investigation, but it's very good to produce indicators and also to show our data and our discoveries, our findings, which looks at different contexts and could be understood by different people in different locations. And qualitative methodologies, they have a bring the details of people's lives and narratives because we needed more in-depth information to understand the context of the territory and also the people involved in these cultural projects. But regardless of whether it was quality or quantity, we also wanted to involve and co-create with these partners. So they were always involved in creating the questionnaires, thinking of what the most important questions would be, because our ultimate objective is to understand what the possible impacts are of these cultural projects on the people in that territory. And there's no one better to be able to help us understand that than those people who are delivering those projects. So our intuition about where the impacts might be were confirmed generally by the research. So we had um, different branches of investigation. Usually there were 3, but we introduced a 4th branch in this specific context. So everybody who works with research knows that when we're in those contexts, we don't have that experience. And we discussed this in the webinars. When you come from outside that region with some knowledge and indicators, etc., that's not how to do good research by imposing your knowledge. We look at what we have available to use and what the people inserted or within that particular universe also feel would be important. So we talked to them to be able to map this region and understanding the context. And then we moved on to number two, which is our activity. So we focused on the organization rather than the territories. And we started looking for these narratives and perceptions. We talked about personal ones, those people who were there, how they started working with culture, what is the work they do, how did they see themselves within that context. Um, and also, we looked at the narratives of the organizations. So the instruments that we used were semi-structured interviews. You ask a question, but you allow the person to respond openly. So you don't bring something that's already well structured in advance. So then we try to understand the impacts and propose ways of measuring these impacts. So to do that, we started doing interviews with a closed questionnaire. So the questions are already very specific with structured responses, but it also helps us to speak to lots of people and compare their responses and create indicators. So we did these interviews, individual interviews, with the public that uses these cultural organizations and also with staff members and ex-staff members of these organizations because we've discovered that the people who work there were also impacted. So, for example, people who work at the Inyochim Institute said, "Oh, I started as an intern and then it changed my life, changed my perception. It affected the course I chose for university." So it's not just the public, someone watching a play or somebody who receives a grant. Um, Very often, the people who work there are also affected. So the fourth branch, the focus being on heritage and the environment, and we started thinking about the perceived risks and diagnosing them because that was very present. Risks are very present there. And it was also, they were very relevant at that moment of doing the research. So that's why we included it. So looking back at our methodology, we talked about indicators and sometimes we don't know why we're talking about these things. So the idea of the impact of culture can be very subjective. So when we're doing a research study, we need to take from this abstract subjective plane um, sort of real indicators because sometimes you say, oh, it makes me happy, it helps me dream and it moves me. And other people might say, oh, the impact of culture was that I didn't have to carry on working, in a small shack, or I got to know somebody and I managed to get some work, and so, or I began to speak in public. So, from this individual abstract subjective plane, we took that data and transformed it into a way that we can communicate it and compare it. So that's the process. We identify a phenomenon, we recognize, sorry, we collect data about this phenomenon. We think about ways we can present this through a variable or an indicator, and we give it a name and so that people can understand what we're talking about. I collect the data. I look at the source of data, which are our people, and then we construct the indicators. And culture can have various impacts in different places. So we identified some of the most important dimensions, which we wanted to investigate and talk about. So we identified that obviously the pandemic and COVID-19 and mental health were very important. after the dam burst, um, the activities of these organizations was essential to be able to um, help people's mental health. People who saw the online documentary saw the importance of the band, San Sebastian band, um, playing in honor of those people who died. So access to these activities, these artistic and cultural activities, is also a dimension we wanted to look at because people then want to know more about a theatre play or an event, an exhibition. So, and sometimes they learn skills like sewing or I've learnt how to plant or I've learned how to speak in public or to dance or to act. So developing these skills is very important. The idea of social capital and expanding social networks is also important. We're not talking about just personal, but also professional networks. Oh, I got to know somebody who gave me the opportunity to work in a film or gave me the opportunity to work in a theatre. So that is also an expansion of networks. Perceived risks to cultural heritage was one dimension we worked on because through having contact with cultural heritage, they begin to understand the risks and usually understand the risks are wider and or larger, greater than they imagined. We also looked at self-confidence because many people reported that they felt more self-assured to be able to talk in public or to defend a colleague who was suffering prejudice or to defend what I believe in. I felt confident enough to read in front of the whole class. That was very common with the young trainee poets in Itabira. So uh, just saying that, oh, I could read in front of my class, that's also an impact. The dimension of identity and belonging is along the lines of I've begun to value my city. I know that this is the city of Carlos Drummond Andrade, and this also is to do with the idea of territory and belonging. So this was very strong in the Quilombo Marinhos. I understand that I live in a Quilombo. What does this mean? I'm proud of it. It allows me to practice traditions. And this also relates to social engagement and political engagement because people have got more self-confidence and have developed certain skills. We notice that this favored their participation in associations like residents associations or taking part in a group at university or in a work union, trade union. So let's talk very briefly about the results of our research because we identified is that the perception is that cultural heritage is under threat because of environmental issues, especially linked to mining, and not just talking about potential dam bursts. Everybody said no, it's not just to do with the dam bursts. Even before those, mining affects us, harms us. The lorries that pass by our houses affect us. The dust that rises affects us. And we also talked about, the health crises and climate crises. At the beginning of the year, there was severe flooding and landslides in Brazil. And this has all changed very quickly in Minas Gerais. It's the same too. Sometimes roads or even rail lines are closed. And um, so we also saw the recent health crisis as a threat because a lot of those organizations had to close and they're part of Minas Gerais' heritage. They lost their economic support that they got from the institutions and almost had to close down. So, talking about the role of art and culture as an instrument to combat these risks, we saw art as a means of expressing denouncements, complaints, formal complaints. Lucas, for example, always gives voice to these complaints. It's also a tool for education because it's a way of bringing these debates to children and young people who might not be aware of them. And it's also an economic alternative to non-sustainable activities related to mining or other unsustainable sectors. That was great. Thank you very much, Natalia. I'm just going to stop you there. Um, do you recognize what you talk about in terms of cultural value in your experiences? Let's have we got microphones for the audience? What do you recognize in the presentation about cultural values in promoting the mental health of people in this territory? Yes. Other comments or reflections about this methodology? Did you begin before, during, or after the pandemic? We started before, but we had to carry out a lot of the project during the pandemic, so we had lots of challenges. But something that's important that Natalia said is that we trained those organizations to do their research. And that's always our work. We always offer these research instruments and tools to these organizations. There are always challenges, but when you have people within the community doing that research, they'll always find a way to do it. And this was very important in our methodology. Any other question about the results or the methodology? And then Vittorio will speak a little bit. Christina? Was this work shared with public bodies, local authorities, etc.? Because it's important for public policies. Yes, we're still in this process. We've already given them our results, but each step was taken based on the research. That was the basis of it. So one branch is education. It was incredible because during the research, lots of people showed or said that there was a lack of interest among young people. And they said that that was the biggest threat to culture. We thought they would say, climate change or sort of earthquakes, etc. But almost everybody in Munis talked about the lack of knowledge or interest or sense of belonging by young people. So we invented another educational project with the local authorities and the education departments. But yes, we did this. We had a big seminar in Inhotim. Duda Salaberti was one of the speakers, and he talked about what is important to identify within public policies to be able to, of course, change things. Because when we think about cultural heritage and a link with mental health, sounds quite odd, but our results show that there is a link. Hello. So the idea of doing this research came from where? Was it because of the dam burst, or did you already have the idea of creating a research about the impacts and the destructive impacts of mining? Or was that the trigger? Yes, it was a trigger. What happens is that when public notices are announced, you read the requirements. So that's what happened. I was reading a public notice, and it was to do with nine. They wanted to do the project in 9 countries, and I said it had to be in Brazil. We could have chosen many other regions, Brazil, Amazon, or the Xingu, but um, I was so impacted by the first visit I made to the quadrangle that I thought that even though this isn't exactly an environmental disaster. It was man-made. It's still part of this. So we gave a very specific argument to include it after the dam burst. I think it was a year after this crime in Brumadinho, and then 3 or 4 years after Mariana. So it was within the context. And I know that our colleagues from FGV will talk about the impact of the Mariana dam burst. It it was an environmental crime that was huge. So I was inspired to think about this situation when I read this public notice. So over to Victoria. Hello. I'm going to present to you some of the results from this research. Um, we wanted to understand what else could be done with these partners. How could we take this beyond this territory, the results, that is? So the first result was the documentary Valley, which we launched recently. I don't know if everybody here today was there. And we were working with to coordinate these young artists and partners to see um, what they could create um, and what culture could do differently, maybe, to make these voices heard even further away. So we worked with these 5 artists who were nominated by the different organizations. So we've got João Alves from Mariana, Lucas Fabrício from Nova Lima, Reba Tuque from the Quilombo, Thiago from Itabira, and Vitor from Brumadinho. He's part of the São Sebastião band that you will see later on. So we wanted to um, vocalize politically um, these voices, yeah. So our other program called Young Ambassadors was the first project that kicked off the educational activities we did to empower young people so that they can talk about climate changes and culture in their territory and then become agents of change within these contexts. So we had a number of meetings to train them so that they could understand and appropriate this knowledge, and also for them to give new ideas through these encounters. So, how does this affect me? Does this make a difference? Would it have been different had I been born elsewhere? And how this dialogues with different realities. So, we worked with young people from all these different territories, and at the end of this project, they inaugurated a series of actions, cultural actions, um, focused on climate change. So for example, there was one young person who created a fair, sustainable fair, and brought lots of people to talk about this and how the economy can be sustainable and creative. And there was a young person who did a documentary in Mariana, and they've managed to develop skills and explore new sides to them and new sides to this subject. So it was a pilot project that was very interesting. So our educational program was a pilot program as well. We understood that education is a tool for change, and we wanted to see how these subjects were being dealt with at school. What do people talk about in terms of climate and cultural heritage in schools, and how could it be different? Um, so we had a partnership between our partners and the artists to be able to do pilot programs, educational pilot programs, to take pedagogic and methodological tools into schools, from children in primary school and in secondary education, and how they can discuss these issues, environment issues related to mining and so on. So here we have some of our results. So around 400 people were impacted by our projects. Even though it was a pilot project, it had a considerable impact. People managed to also develop methodologies that were very interesting, um, focusing on art, and there was production of knowledge. So looking at these three elements of, the climate, culture, and heritage. Sometimes it's difficult to, relate these areas, but they are linked. But that was also part of the production of knowledge. And now we have a new phase of this project for 2023, where these organizations exchanged their methodologies, compared them with, they constructed new methodologies and new working tools through art. So the San Sebastian band, the Casa Quilombe, Lucas Fabricio, and Thiago also developed many tools through rap, poetry, and performance. And it became a melting pot of very interesting work that was produced from it. So the territories, there was an exchange. So Itabira did a workshop in Nova Lima and vice versa. So this was interesting because they could they could see how the challenges that are, faced by each different city can be similar. So here we have some results from this new phase. So um, the there were around 1,300 people who took part, who were impacted, talking about children, young people from schools. The exchange of knowledge as well was very valuable. And and then also we looked at how different art forms like music can be used to convey messages and communicate and dialogue with people about this issue. And as a result of that, we're producing a research project with these young people, um, to understand how, what their opinions were before taking part in this project and afterwards, to be able to assess that better. And then we had the Rio arm of our project, which was to do with cultural managers for the climate. And the objective was for us to train them with 20 managers from 10 different cultural facilities run by the city council, to be able to dialogue more with the community and talk about the environment and culture and so on. And what was interesting was how isolated they felt and how great it was for them to be able to join together and exchange between them. So there were people from Pavuna and people from Gavia, which are, neighborhoods that are very far apart within the city. So each of them produced a project that was then implemented in September last year, and produced some interesting impacts. And so finally, we had Amma here, which is a project that was inspired by the Young Ambassadors methodology, and was a training program where the young people had access to 7 different cultural facilities, and they talked to Rio artists who were able to think about creative solutions for their territories. So at the end of this activity, they inaugurated 7 physical works of art like sculptures and so on, which talked about the climate, art, and culture. And then very quickly, um, some results of our assessment with these young people. So 9 out of 10 of the young people confirmed that this is an opportunity to engage with other young people in their communities and to debate the issues of the future. And then 7 out of 10 of them felt more confident in discussing and proposing improvements to their communities and developing artistic and cultural actions. So it was important to show these young people how they can be agents of change. And it's an example of how we can transform a research project, which might be a little bit abstract, and how we can sort of bring it close to reality and have an impact on reality. Thank you, Victoria. Natalia, Mariana, would you like to come? It's very difficult, their methodology, but it's very much related. Can art save the world? That's going to be our research now. But did you understand how we establish um, an element of research and create initiatives? And those initiatives are based on the results of that research. Does anybody have any questions? We have one of the artists from Amahio who's from Realengo, Madureira. We're having a little technical issue. I just wanted to make a quick comment. What happened in Madureira, what we saw on the last slide with the 7 in 10 young people, I think the transformation was very quick comparing how they entered the program and left. So I think art has that power because it's not chronological. It's something that happens from all sides. You don't need time necessarily to understand or to process. It can be something that's very quick, swift acting. Very good. So, João, could you pass these around, please, to get everybody's contact? So, Natalia, Mariana, we're now going to start talking about Getúlio Vargas, and we're within the building called the Memorial Getúlio Vargas. And they were with us in a webinar recently, and now they're back again. So thank you ever so much for taking part. So good morning to you. I'm Natalia. This is Mariana, my colleague. For those of you who saw the webinar, we presented one of our cases, and we're going to be showing you this methodology. So at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, we worked in the river valley of the Rio Doce in the area that was affected by the dam burst, the Fundão dam burst. We've been working there for 4 years, and we're going to show you a little bit of its methodology. So it was very profound and difficult work. We're very much in solidarity with those affected by this type of disaster because we have lots of slides and lots to say, so I'll try and be quick. So we want to show our methodology, this collective construction of the damage and looking at the non-monetary value of the damage caused by the dam bursts. So here we've got a picture of the oil spill, or the waste spill, I should say, in the ocean. And we've got some of these these pictures that were created by Carolina Ribeiro. You see a lot of them. She was collecting data with us, and she did these illustrations um, for a project for the project looking at gender and how the disaster affected women specifically. So this illustration is called Territory and shows you a little bit. So in our methodology, in our conversation with people who were affected, we we were also noting down and recording what people said about the disaster. And so here are some of them. So Rio Doce was in panic. It was horrible, full of people coming, animals, gas canisters, and we were on a bridge. There was no one there who could. There were children who were watching everything, and they were traumatized, asking if they were going to die. They were shocked by what they saw. So we had a lot of these kind of statements, but we had to create a relationship of trust so that people could talk about these feelings about the disaster. Here's a photo from the upper part of the Rio Doce near Mariana. This is the context. More than 45 different local authorities were affected. We actually don't know how big the disaster was. It was the worst environmental disaster involving a dam burst, a mining dam burst ever, and so it's it's caused huge damage, and it hasn't even finished. There are still people who could become affected by this in the future and haven't been identified yet. So in terms of the data, here it was the biggest, worst disaster with 60 million cubic meters of waste along more than 600 kilometers, more than 45 different districts, lots of 40 different quilombos and traditional people's communities, 19 deaths and innumerable damage to the environment and to socioeconomic conditions. So we're now so I won't go into too many details, but we were hired according to an agreement which envisaged the hiring of experts. So FGV was hired as an expert. So there was an agreement that had been signed before, but it was seen as being insufficient because there wasn't the community participation, and it was so the federal public prosecutor's office and the state one as well took out a civil action to claim more damages and have a better agreement and to involve the people who are affected within the river basin. So from 2019, FGV began this work, but there are other experts. So we were FGV was responsible for diagnosing the socio-economic impacts, but there was another organization to look at the environmental damage. There was also the Fundo Brasil, who was responsible for hiring these experts, and FGV, our organization, to look at, as I said, the socio-economic costs. So within the FGV, lots of different schools within our organization took part. That means that lots of different methodologies were used. So we're from the Center for Sustainability Studies, and one of our objectives is to guarantee the participation and also listen to the affected people and collect the data about the damage through the voices of those affected people. So there is also the law school. Um, they translated the data that came from the field work to translate it into a legal language. The applied math school also diagnosed the health of the people, and that's also happening at the moment. It hasn't finished yet. We're looking at secondary data now. Um, we were the economics school as well, did a survey about profit and how the gross domestic product or the domestic product of that region has changed. And so our objective was to identify the negative impacts and the ways of life and how they have been changed by a collective construction of this research. When we talk about culture and heritage, we're talking about the lives of people. We're not necessarily talking about listed buildings. We're talking about day-to-day culture, identity, etc. How people related to the river, how they lived with the river, and how they belong to that region, and how that has been completely changed. So our principles is to make the affected people central. There's got to be social participation, valuing of local knowledge, and looking at territories and respecting regional territorial characteristics. So what did we do? So we consulted these affected people, and then we qualified, as in the sense that we measured these this damage. We were looking at damage of all kinds, whether tangible or intangible, and we know that in processes of reparation, obviously material damage is more evident and more easy to quantify, but a lot of the intangible damage is invisible in this process. So our idea by looking at the non-monetary value of the damage was to give visibility to this immaterial damage, intangible damage, the damage people were talking about. And when we talk about qualifying, we're talking about recording it, recording what had happened, that people used to live one way and had to live in a different way, that this generated sadness, anguish, mental health issues, and there were issues with well-being and people's quality of life. So that was our non-monetary valuing of this damage by describing it and recording it. So we took photos and we had posters, notices as well that people showed us throughout this process. This is Carol. Oh, sorry, this is an illustration by Carolina called House, Casa. No institution had the sensibility to come and explain to the population what was happening. The explanations that we got were through social or media and through mass communication. So they're talking here about a lack of respect and lack of information that was given to them. So when we started this project, we started with a concept of cultural heritage that we decided to set aside because when we realized we weren't just talking about physical cultural heritage that's maybe listed, as it were. So we were talking more about mean ways of life and intangible culture. So we started with this concept, and we in FGV we've got lots of experts. So we used this idea of ecosystemic services, which are the benefits that nature offers us for our well-being. It's kind of controversial because to say that nature has a service is almost like it as though it's here to serve humanity. But it did serve us in terms of helping us because the disaster entered people's lives through ecosystems. So it was a devastation to ecosystems that completely ruined the way people live their lives. So we looked at the different forms of interaction that people have with these ecosystems and environments and between themselves. So with this idea of ecosystemic services, we also have this idea of the value. So we also looked at valuing in different ways too, I'd like to say here. We wanted to look at value as importance, what importance it has, not its monetary value. So for this, it has to be acknowledged and described. So when we think about cultural ecosystemic services, we're talking about intangible systems which nature offers us. And here we're talking about how these values are linked to cultural heritage and cultural identity, to relationships, to scenic beauty, recreation, to leading a satisfactory life. So we focused on these aspects during our conversations. This is another illustration by Carol called Abundance. So Rio Doce was a source of inspiration. I have three daughters, and when we had the Colachina festivals, both our generation, my generation, and their generation had those festivals on the Avenida Beira Rio. Who was the protagonist there? It was the river, almost invisible, but our connection with the river has always been there. The river has been in everything. In schools, the river was a source of poetry and also stories, and that's now been broken. So I think I've already talked about our objectives, to identify, describe these values, make sure that they're registered. And for this, we had to um, join together or bring together different types of information. And obviously, people have different values, as it were, or different levels of importance for culture. But we were also there to accept and emphasize the immeasurability and plurality of the value of what had been lost. So we didn't want to prioritize one element of culture more than other, but we just wanted to record it and describe it also with that caveat that some of it is immeasurable. And then our choice of methods, we chose more descriptive methods. So these slides will be made available to you. And we're also open to questions if anybody has any. So this idea of ecosystemic services first appeared in the 1980s. The document is Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Sorry, that was in 2005. And so it was from that point onwards that this idea came out from the academic world and became more practical. These days, there are other discussions around it and other ways of naming it. So it's still a discussion that's bubbling away. So here's another of the illustrations called Net. And here's another um, narrative. When I come home, I look at my needle and I cry. Why am I going to bother stitching up the net? Uh, it makes me want to cry. When I knew what happened, I sat on the side of the river and cried. It really was hugely sad and affected our emotions. I sit here, get here, and cry. What else am I going to do? I've already got fish dying on the edge of the river. Our health has come to an end, and our sadness is immense. So, just to carry on where Nachi left off, um, we had to, involve the public prosecutor's office to help us get better compensation, but it's still well below the reparation that should have been offered. So it was a huge challenge for us to create these narratives and also translate this all to a language that would fit within a legal battle. And we had to show the importance of cultural heritage and other non-monetary values. So we identified the damage that had been caused, and then we measured the non-monetary value. And then with the law school helping us a lot, we also valued the amount of compensation the um, for people who were affected. So the what was offered was for moral damages was 10,000 reais, which is like 2,000 US dollars. Um, we said that these amounts had to be much larger. Of course, we can't put a price on this, but we have to give a better price or put a better price on this at the same time with our argument. So here's the collective construction of the damage assessment. So first of all, we had an initial research study with the groups that lived there. We then approached these groups more and the local authorities, and then we planned the research and carried it out. So we had workshops. Sometimes there was just one municipality involved, and sometimes it was across different local authorities. So, so through these workshops, we extracted these narratives, and we also, as I say, translated this for legal purposes. So we had to separate these narratives, or divide them into thematic categories because ways of life don't fit into categories very easily, and that's very difficult to do. What has it affected this disaster, and how can we say this? I'll say a little bit more later, but that's what we did. We divided it up into health, damage to food, etc. And then we systematized that and recorded it all in our data bank. We reported this in long documents and analyses, and then we went back to those communities at the last year, and we had 20 different processes of returning the research, as it were, to the community. As if like the research was not complex enough. When the pandemic happened, we had to move our methodology online, which fortunately worked out. and everybody was very mobilized to take part in the communities. So we used Zoom, Teams, the telephone, everything was used and taken into account. Here are the thematic dimensions. There are 11 of them altogether. So through the narratives, we worked out what the damage had been done, damage to ways of life, recognized types of damage, like legally recognized damage, for us to be able to have a foundation, a basis from which to argue our case. And we we divided all the damage into these 11 different categories because, as I said, we can't put lives into neatly into categories, but we needed to. So we've got here health, environment, um, housing, education, um, remediation, and compensation, because there are lots of people who are going through this process. Cultural, religious, and leisure practices, social networks, self-determination, a dignified life, use of time rather, income and work, and also food. They're all interconnected, and a lot of the narratives we got would fit into many of these dimensions. So here is one example. So we had one to do with food from Itaúna, to do with fish. We lost our most natural source of food, and so then we translated it into this sort of more legal text, the relationship between um, means of subsistence of the population and questions linked to the loss of sovereignty and sources of food. Here's another example. So through the narrative, we took the damage, the example of the damage. Here it's a socio-economic damage. We explain what the damage is and the related legal damages. So collective and individual moral damage and existential damage in this case. The next step was our non-monetary valuing um, of these intangible cultures. So we went further into this. And how did we do this? So we triangulated our information. So we had the dialogue with the people who had been affected. And we also did a review, a bibliographic and written analysis as well. And then we did interviews with researchers and specialists within that field. So if we were talking about young people, um, we would interview specialists within this area, for example. So all this triangulation um, of information gave us very robust results. And from what people told us about the damage that they suffered, we used different methods to corroborate what people said. It wasn't just their opinion. And we've got a literary basis and an academic basis to corroborate what is being said. So we looked at different types of values, knowledge, and the idea was to put all this together. Um, so here we have another example of the scope of each valuation, but it's important to know that, you know, if we were talking about the effect on the income and work, it affects that territory, but it also is something that the rest of the river basin also suffers. So we had these reports that we wrote, and now we're summarizing all these reports. Uh, um, so we are trying to, sort of, what's the word, take responsibility for this. and not just the public prosecutor's office. We also looked at different forms of um, compensation, including for moral damages, and a whole compensation package is just one part of a process of reparation. So we're going to bring the band on in a minute, but does anybody have any questions or comments? So good morning. Congratulations, Paul, and congratulations, FGV, for your work too. You talked about reparation, but not so we're not talking about Brazil as a whole. Reparation is constant and precedes this moment that the tragedy happened. I think you have already potentially accessed a community which is in which has an eternal debt in terms of reparation. I just wanted to talk about pre and post the disaster and how if this has it got worse or as Christina has just asked, do the local governments feel that they need to take this on board? Is that happening? And my final question, after 30 years of mining exploration, the company is obliged to return that land and convert it into parks, like the Eden project in the UK and Inyochino as well is another example. So, did you perceive that there was any initiative of to repair for these damages, and if there is a future location, maybe, or like maybe a point of, a spark of hope? You can, of course, reply, but we do have someone here from Inyochim who could perhaps respond too. So you're absolutely right. The disaster has many roots that happen before and consequences afterwards. We talk about years and years of mining and destruction, environmental destruction. And, we've got lots of examples of negligence even before the disasters. But in terms of reparation, so we talk about there are lots of battles for this compensation, but there are other models of reparation, like projects, for example. All I can say is that with Rio Doce, with the Rio Doce region, the foundation that was created for Rio Doce was not based on the example from Inhotim because that was seen as being a failure. Oh, sorry, Brumadinho rather. That was seen as a failure because there was a lack of valuing lots of different dimensions. It doesn't talk about traditional communities, etc. So hello to everyone. I am from Inhotim, but I'm also from the Casa Quilombe, um, and I'm also an educator in terms of critical thinking. And when we think about mining, it's an injustice. There's no way of compensating these regions. When you think about botanical gardens, so on and so forth, yes. But do these people feel like they belong to these territories because these relationships are very important. And that's what we at the Kazakh always fight for, to say that we are from and we can actually own and belong to certain territories. So a question that I have is how did you get to these communities to be able to involve them in the research? Because a lot of researchers and investigators come to our territory, but they don't come back because territories understand that that research is important, but it's also important for these communities. So it's important to give this research back to these regions. That was a very good question. We've got some young people here too as well. What do you think about this idea of research and the project that was presented to you? Do you think we've shown the importance of the research that is done and the importance of returning, giving this research back to communities? So art and research is a question of registering, recording a story. If you don't, you're going to end up erasing it, and that's a crime. So I think it's really important what you said. We have to learn to live with that. It's happened. It's a fact. It was a crime. It could happen again, but we can't erase it and pretend it never happened. We need to work with what happened. It shouldn't have happened, but we've got to a critical stage. And from now on, what do we do? Is it art? Is it research? Is it everything? Is it field work? Because to if when you meddle with mining organizations, it's like meddling with criminal organizations. They will threat you. So doing this speed work and defending people who are in this territory is important. So maybe we can think about research as a light that we shine on something to focus on it. As a good followers of Hamlet, we need to try and avoid the tragedy. Um, but sometimes we kind of like enjoy almost this tragedy. Think about the stakeholders and this international cooperation that's happening because we've got the UK interfacing with Brazil. Um, so we need to think about environmental rights, the environmental racism that has happened, which is clear in the research. So, um, how long and how, will we carry on sort of like obsessing with this disaster? Because it's something that was, we knew would happen long before it happened. So, so at the same time that this happened in Minas Gerais, from a fracture that was already visible, we need to think about how we can advance because if that happens there, it happens in the Amazonian region, in the north of the country. So, as civil society, we need to sort of think about this. So, how are we, how far are we advocating and how far are we pressuring um, the authorities to change? So coming back to the academic world, um, I wanted to point out the participatory methodologies, thinking of Paulo Freire, which takes into account for whom you're doing this. It's incredibly important. So in the two methodologies that we saw, we've seen this moment of dialogue and of constructing together with the object, because that is also reparation. Because if you're doing this with people who have been affected and becoming aware of the damage that was done, it means that they are aware of it and they can act from that. So we need to come back to Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. Congratulations for your work. It is really necessary and important. And I'd like to emphasize here that disasters normally happen and we only know about it when it happens. The media indulges in sensationalism. Um, Ideally, we would get there before. So the idea of the educating people about heritage, thinking about it widely, and taking into account all those aspects, not just tangible, but intangible, as you said. If we could get ahead of ourselves, as it were, and identify each element of this cultural heritage, traditions, and so on, we can then maybe protect them before the disaster happens, because that's the most important thing for us, prevention rather than cure. So we're just asking people to leave the stage because we brought the band along. So do we have a response to Janja from Natalia? Do we have time? And so you're absolutely right. How to return this to the community. So we went there in person to take them these tables of damage and values. So we're taking these huge reports now, we're summarizing them, and our technical consultants who should have been hired at the beginning, they're being hired now. So they are now going to be involved in the judicial battle. But we're going to create a book of the narratives of the um, testimonials that we got from people so that we can then go back with these results, because the community who generated these results needs to appropriate, them, need to sort of like um, own the material that they offered. So it's a complex process, but it's still underway. Very quickly, I don't know if it's been asked, but for, how do you pass this research process to um, to the community so they can be compensated not just in terms of remuneration monetarily, but also for them to be able to reconstruct the environment that was destroyed. As our friend said, so they can feel that they're at home. And as you said at the beginning, for them to be able to reconstruct what was damaged without erasing what happened. So one thing that I think is rather than uncomfortable, sort of living in the quilombola, is the way that things come to us. There's an institutional racism that is underway, an environmental racism as well, and technological racism that we suffer. So, so our vote is important, but nothing comes back to us. So things that should arrive, in terms of technology and environmental protections, don't come to us. There's institutional racism, environmental and technological racism. You can't, we don't have internet, so how can we send an email? Nothing is happening for us. And I feel uncomfortable when we talk about a disaster. It wasn't a disaster, it was a murder. Everyone talks about disaster. It wasn't a disaster. It was a murder, a mass murder. Valley killed people. So my feeling is that with strengthening value, because people don't say it was a murder, they say it was a disaster, which is a relief for that company. So we're going to have a short pause now. I'd like to thank the Prefeitura for opening the debate, FGV as well, FGV, also Spectaculo. But let's end with art. We're going to end with the São Sebastião Band from Brumadinho, and we're going to end then with this experiment with Thiago, Skip from Itabira and Rei Batuque from the Quilombo Marinhos. So thank you, everyone. Can we have the stage lights? It's a huge pleasure to be here and for us to be able to play some music to you. I'm not going to say too much. So we're going to start with the Aquarela do Brasil, which talks about the environment. Exuberant. This coconut tree that gives us coconuts where I tie my hammock. So lots of references, and it's a wonderful song. We should be preserving this and not destroying this. Then we also composed a song especially for this moment, which we will end with. And even though it doesn't have any lyrics, it's for us, it talks of the environment and the situation that Heiba Tuki mentioned, and Marcelo and Thiago will come along as well to join us with the African drum. We did presentation um, um, before, but it's great to join together with new musicians. So hey and Thiago, Thank you for being here with us. thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Hey Batuki and Thiago to join us. So as I said before, this piece is special, especially composed for now. Even being instrumental, it's about the environment. So this is the reason we wrote this. And so Thiago will then pay tribute as well through his lyrics by singing with us, rapping with us. thank you very much. This is the Sao Sebastian band, and I hope we see each other many more times. Xiagun Hey, thank you ever so much.